Edward Pierce had lived a life defined by control, precision, and order. After nearly 4 decades as a high-voltage electrical engineer, he retired with just enough pension and savings to do what he'd always quietly planned: move far away from the city's noise and bureaucracy into a modest, well-built single-story home in a peaceful cul-de-sac on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house wasn't grand, but it had character: a brick facade, a small but lush garden with boxwood hedges, and most importantly, space. Privacy. The kind of space where a man could be left alone, breathe freely, and take pride in maintaining every square foot of his property without being subjected to arbitrary interference or unwanted surveillance. He chose the neighborhood carefully. No central authority, no tightly knit homeowners' circle, no formal association. Just a street of privately owned houses, each with its own fencing, driveways, and a blend of mostly retired residents living their routines at a comfortable distance from one another. Edward didn't mind talking to people. He simply disliked intrusion. His social life was deliberate and respectful. Polite nods to neighbors during early walks, the occasional exchange over the mailbox, or a casual comment about the weather or seasonal planting. But mostly, his days were centered on his home, the surrounding garden, and a schedule that he had come to cherish. He had reconstructed the backyard path using level concrete stones, interspersed with soft gravel. He trimmed his hedges with geometrical exactness. The lawn was reseeded, level, and free of weeds. He spent early evenings tuning the irrigation system and checking the soil conditions, and he had recently completed his favorite addition yet: low-voltage garden lighting. It was not just decorative, it was functional, intentional, and beautifully done. After his knee surgery 2 years ago, Edward had grown especially wary of tripping hazards, particularly during his late evening walks from the shed to the back door. He researched the market for safe, downward-cast LED fixtures that wouldn't spill light into his neighbors' windows, choosing full cutoff models with narrow beam angles. He carefully mapped out the circuits, installed timers, and included weather-sealed junction boxes mounted beneath soil level to reduce visible clutter. The lights illuminated the path along his eastern fence, leading from his back gate to the side of the house. They gave off a warm, subtle glow, enough to see clearly without disturbing the natural darkness of the yard. There was no flickering, no buzzing, no harsh color. Just peace, safety, and a small expression of craftsmanship. At first, he noticed nothing unusual after installation. The lights functioned exactly as planned. In fact, he caught a few quiet glances from the older couple across the street, who smiled and gestured approvingly when he adjusted the brightness on his front path one evening. But one morning, Edward woke up and noticed something odd. A portion of the back pathway lights, 3 of the fixtures he had installed with such care, were off. He checked the timer box, the breaker, the weather seals. Everything was intact. Curious, he walked the length of the wire conduit, brushing away soil and small rocks until he reached the junction where the main wire met the first lamp. That's when he saw it. The wire had been cut. Not chewed, not weathered. Cut. Clean with a tool. And not in one spot, but in 2. Just enough to disable the section without damaging the fixtures themselves. He frowned and double-checked the rest of the system. Several more wires were tampered with, all snipped at inconspicuous points hidden just beneath the topsoil. He stood for a long moment in the yard, silent, scanning the surrounding houses. Everything was still. The morning sun filtered through the cypress trees near the fence, casting dappled shadows across the ground. A robin fluttered from the trellis and disappeared. No signs of entry. No footprints. No disturbances to the mulch or gravel path. At first, he wondered if it had been a kid, maybe some local teen bored out of their mind. But there were no signs of stomping or recklessness. Whoever had done this had gone out of their way not to leave a mess. The cuts were deliberate. Edward sighed and, rather than react emotionally, simply gathered the necessary tools, repaired the lines, and restored the connection. He added protective conduit caps and buried the wires deeper this time, making note of the changes in his repair log. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened in a neighborhood. He chalked it up to one-off mischief. But 2 nights later, the lights failed again. And this time, they were missing entirely. Not broken, not left in the yard. Gone. 4 of the fixtures had been unscrewed at the base and removed. The wires again were cleanly cut, left poking up like clipped roots. He examined the soil. No signs of animal disturbance. No misaligned footprints. This wasn't accidental, nor was it random vandalism. Someone had walked into his yard, taken their time, and methodically removed components of his lighting system. He walked the property line and checked the lock on the side gate. It was unlatched, but not broken. Whoever had entered had done so quietly, likely with tools in hand. Edward's stomach knotted, not with fear, but with a slow-burning tension he hadn't felt in years. The following morning, a note appeared in his mailbox. No envelope, no signature, no postmark. A half sheet of paper, folded twice. Inside, in all caps and thick pen strokes, were the words, "You've made the street look like a prison yard. Take it down, or it's coming down." No name, no explanation. He read it once, then twice, then folded it and placed it into a folder marked Correspondence in his home office. He didn't panic. He didn't yell. He didn't even feel angry yet. He simply began compiling documentation. Step 1. File a vandalism report with local police. He provided photographs, serial numbers of the missing fixtures, and a copy of the note. The officer who visited was polite but vague. Without footage or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do, but they logged it. He was advised to install cameras, just in case, and let the department know if anything escalated. Edward didn't rush into surveillance. He didn't like the idea of filling his garden with blinking red lights or feeding cloud-based systems with footage of his private space. Instead, he contacted a security consultant he once worked with on an industrial job site, a quiet, professional man who specialized in perimeter monitoring. Together, they designed a discrete sensor grid for the backyard, motion-sensitive pressure mats beneath stepping stones, low-frequency acoustic vibration sensors mounted along the fence, and an inconspicuous alarm trigger at the gate latch. Meanwhile, Edward replaced the lighting, again, this time with tamper-proof screws and added depth below the soil line. He didn't make any announcements. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't speculate, gossip, or involve neighbors. But a week after the reinstallation, just as he returned from a hardware store run, he saw her. Karen, the neighbor 3 doors down, leaning against her fence, arms crossed, lips pressed into a flat line as she stared across the yard. Edward offered a polite nod. She didn't return it. Instead, she called out over the fence, "You know, some people here would like to sleep without feeling like they lived next to a warehouse loading dock." Her voice was sharp, controlled, and entirely performative, projected just loud enough for others to overhear. Edward paused, keys still in hand, and responded in a neutral tone. "It's safety lighting, Karen. Low voltage. Timed for off-peak hours." She smiled thinly. "Well, safety shouldn't blind the entire street." He didn't answer. He simply opened his gate, walked inside, and closed it behind him. He had dealt with difficult people in high-pressure situations for most of his life. But something about Karen wasn't just difficult. She was surgical. Passive-aggressive, but organized. The kind of person who didn't break the rules. She redirected them, bent them, used them like a scalpel. He knew then that the damage to his lights wasn't random. It was targeted. And he hadn't seen the last of it. 3 days after the terse exchange with Karen, Edward returned home from his usual afternoon walk to find his front porch unusually quiet. The breeze had stilled, and the late sun was casting sharp, slanted light across the entryway, accentuating the slight warping of the shadows along his fence. Something in the air felt slightly wrong, though nothing appeared obviously out of place. It wasn't until he unlocked the door and turned toward the side yard to check the irrigation timer that he noticed the faint scratches on the wooden gate latch. They weren't accidental. The small brass piece that held the gate in place had clearly been tampered with, gouged just enough for a tool to slide underneath and flip it open without lifting the handle. Edward crouched down, inspecting it more closely. Tiny flecks of paint had flaked off at the edge of the latch, and one of the two screws had been replaced, slightly longer than the other, with a different thread. That was no accident. That was deliberate interference. He didn't say a word, didn't sigh or curse. Instead, he stood up and calmly walked the perimeter of his yard, slowly scanning for other changes. The light fixtures were still intact, still operational. The mulch hadn't been disturbed, but when he reached the far edge of his property line, near the hedge that separated his lawn from the vacant plot next door, he stopped. Nestled just under the edge of the shrubbery, obscured but not buried, was a small heap of discarded wires. His wires. He recognized the black insulation and the faint blue electrical tape he had used on the original installation. Someone had not only cut the old lighting but gathered the waste and dumped it back on his property, barely out of sight. It was a message, one he understood perfectly well. Later that evening, Edward sat at his kitchen table, turning the pieces over in his hands as he replayed every step he'd taken since the first disappearance. The gates were now secure, but it no longer mattered. Someone knew how to bypass the locks. The timing of the events, the escalation in method, and now the unambiguous confrontation with Karen all pointed in one direction. She was the actor, or, at the very least, the instigator. But he couldn't prove it. And the frustrating part wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the confidence she exuded during their last exchange. Her tone had carried the unmistakable rhythm of someone convinced they were right, not morally perhaps, but socially, as if she believed the very existence of his lighting was offensive, regardless of legality or practicality. It was, to her, an ideological transgression. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. The shadows from his trees moved across the walls as the wind picked up, and he found himself thinking not about safety or legal recourse, but about pattern recognition, the way small aggressions, left unchecked, begin to grow teeth. He had seen it before in bureaucratic circles during his work years, the slow boiling point where someone turns from annoyed to vengeful without warning. By 2 a.m, he had made up his mind. He would not escalate with threats or direct confrontation. He would escalate quietly, legally, and with precision. The next morning, he drove out to a local office supply store and purchased a new locking mailbox with a reinforced steel flap. He replaced his old one within the hour. Then he contacted a local attorney, not to open a case, but to schedule a consultation on documentation and residential property rights. He wasn't preparing for battle. He was preparing for the erosion of plausible deniability, for the inevitable moment when things would no longer be subtle. When he returned from the attorney's office later that week, he found a manila envelope taped directly to his garage door. No address, no return info, just a hand-scrawled note inside that read, "You were warned. You're not special." Beneath the note were several blurry printouts, photographs of his own house taken from a distance, presumably from across the street. One of them was circled with red ink, highlighting the garden lighting. Another had his house number circled, and a third showed him kneeling in the yard, likely taken during his repairs. Edward stood with the pages in his hand for several minutes, unmoving. This wasn't just harassment. It was now personal. He brought the photos inside, scanned them into his computer, and emailed them to the officer who had filed his initial complaint. Within an hour, he received a response. They'd add the images to the record, but again stated there was little they could do unless there was a witness or physical confrontation. Edward wasn't surprised, nor was he disappointed. He didn't expect immediate protection, but the record was growing and the trail was no longer invisible. He then took the next logical step, requesting a private mediation appointment through the town's Neighborhood Dispute Resolution Service. It wasn't a lawsuit, and it wasn't a complaint. It was a procedural tool, meant to bring conflicting parties to a neutral table under municipal guidance. He suspected Karen would refuse the invitation, and she did, but the refusal itself was archived. That mattered. It demonstrated non-cooperation in the face of formal outreach. Edward received a letter of record from the mediator stating the details. The meeting was offered, documented, declined. Paperwork, once again, working quietly in his favor. A few days later, he decided to reinforce the lighting system, not by making it brighter, but by making it smarter. He upgraded to a programmable control system, hidden inside a sealed box in the garage, accessible only by biometric lock. He adjusted the timing. The front path lights would dim after midnight but stay on, while the rear lights would activate only upon detection of sound level shifts above a certain threshold. He avoided cameras, not for any moral reason, but because they changed the character of the house. Instead, he opted for strategic deterrence. Systems designed not to provoke, but to make tampering more time-consuming, more obvious, and ultimately less worth the effort. But the real escalation arrived not with damage, but with bureaucracy. One morning, he received a formal letter from the county's Residential Infrastructure Division. It stated that a citizen complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized exterior lighting visible from multiple neighboring properties, citing vague environmental regulations and claims of light pollution. Edward read the document twice. It was clearly drafted from a template and included no evidence, but the implication was clear. Someone had weaponized the complaint system. He responded immediately, attaching documentation of all fixtures, their wattage, shielding classification, and manufacturer's spec sheets showing full compliance with local codes. He also included his signed inspection approval from the company that installed them. A week later, the complaint was dismissed. The complaint, however, was added to his property record, visible in future title checks. That's when Edward's concern changed shape. The goal wasn't to win a debate. The goal was to smear his presence on paper, to create a legacy of disputes that would live on past his own tenure in the house. That kind of pettiness, subtle, calculated, corrosive, was more dangerous than graffiti or broken lights. It wasn't chaos. It was narrative control. Late one evening, as he walked through his yard making final checks on the lighting timers, he noticed something odd near the corner of the fence. A small silver object partially buried under a stepping stone. He bent down, lifted it, and uncovered what appeared to be a digital light sensor, crudely attached to a makeshift timing circuit. It wasn't his, and it wasn't professionally installed. Someone had planted a sensor, probably meant to detect his lighting schedule. He disassembled it, placed it in a bag, and stored it in his workshop without comment. At that point, Edward stopped seeing the issue as a neighborhood dispute. It had morphed into a campaign, one with consistent pressure, evolving tactics, and a singular antagonist who operated through indirect means. He didn't fear Karen. What he feared was the precedent. If she could sabotage his systems, file complaints under his name, circulate images of him without consequence, and then disappear behind the fence of plausible deniability, what else would she try? He decided then that the next move would not be about recovery. It would be about visibility. Not for others, but for her. If she didn't want lighting, she was going to see exactly what light could become when it was turned against her. Not illegally. Not maliciously, but strategically, proportionally, and with absolute clarity. She wanted darkness. He would give her light. It started with a decision made not out of frustration, but with the deliberate patience of someone who had spent a career dealing with high-voltage systems, risk mitigation protocols, and disaster scenarios where a wrong move could cost lives. Edward didn't react emotionally when the photos appeared or when the planted sensor was unearthed near his fence. He simply sat down at his workbench one evening, drew out a blank schematic sheet, and began planning. The light was no longer merely an issue of safety or aesthetics. It had become a message, and messages could be designed with purpose. The first thing he did was research the illumination tolerance standards for residential neighborhoods, cross-referencing the county's most recent revisions with international guidelines on glare, intensity, and spill control. There were loopholes, so long as the source of light didn't directly penetrate someone's property through a shared structure, and so long as it could be classified as a temporary or movable feature, it didn't fall under the same scrutiny as fixed installations. The next step was procurement. He made 2 phone calls. One to an old colleague who had retired from a construction equipment rental service, and another to a small supplier who specialized in outdoor sports facility lighting. Within a week, a single mobile floodlight unit was delivered to his property. A sleek, generator-capable frame on a wheeled chassis, with retractable supports and a fully adjustable mast that could raise the LED array to nearly 15 feet. It was billed as a temporary worksite lighting platform, and met every specification for mobile industrial lighting used in roadworks and stadium sidelines. There was nothing illegal about owning it. There was nothing unlawful about using it. And when placed at the far end of his backyard, the mast pointed just above the property line, throwing light into the space above Karen's second-story bedroom window without ever technically crossing into her home. He didn't activate it the first night. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he let it sit there, folded down, cables neatly wrapped, the metal cold and unthreatening. 2 days passed without activity. Karen didn't speak, didn't knock, didn't hover at the fence. The silence was almost strange. Then, on the 3rd night, just after 11 p.m., Edward rolled the unit into position, adjusted the beam to a narrow, defined cone, and powered it on for exactly 1 hour. The light was not blinding. It was precise, intense, and perfectly controlled, casting a rectangle of illumination directly into the sky-facing side of Karen's house without touching any other adjacent structure. He stood by the garage, arms crossed, watching as the beam formed its perfect geometry against the backdrop of midnight shadows. 20 minutes later, he heard a door slam. Then the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice, muffled, angry, and rising in pitch. She didn't call for him. She called for the sky to acknowledge her discomfort, to announce to anyone listening that a terrible injustice had occurred. But no neighbors stirred. No one else emerged. She was alone in her outrage, and Edward made no move to engage. He left the light on for the remainder of the hour, then shut it down and wheeled it back into the shed. The following day, there was no knock at his door, no verbal accusations. Instead, a white envelope appeared in his mailbox, this time with a typed message. This constitutes harassment. You are being watched. Stop now or legal action will follow. No signature, no reference to any law, just the vague specter of consequence suspended like a threat with no anchor. Edward filed it away and, without comment, adjusted the mast to a slightly higher angle, redirecting the beam above Karen's property so that it struck the reflective gutter trim along her upper eaves. The light bounced, weakly, but enough to cause an irregular flickering effect in the window panes. He knew what it would look like from inside, an inconsistent flash, like passing cars or distant sirens. Not harmful, not invasive, but noticeable. That night, he activated the beam for only 30 minutes. A new variable, not a pattern. He did the same 2 days later, then skipped a night, then activated it for 15 minutes only, with the beam diffused through a mesh panel that gave the light a slightly rippling texture. Nothing permanent, Nothing illegal, just visible. The psychological impact, however, was immediate. Karen's blinds, which had once remained open well into the evening, were now drawn by sundown. Her backyard porch lights were kept off and her windows shut tight. But, more importantly, the notes stopped. No new letters, no veiled complaints, no sideways accusations, until the utility inspector showed up. It happened on a Thursday, just after Edward had returned from his physiotherapy session. A white pickup with municipal markings pulled into his driveway, and a man in a collared shirt and clipboard approached the porch with a neutral expression. He introduced himself as a representative of the Residential Utilities Inspection Program, stating that a complaint had been filed regarding excessive power draw from the grid during off-peak hours, and that he was authorized to inspect the property's outdoor power systems to ensure compliance with energy usage thresholds. Edward, calm as ever, invited the man into the garage, presented the generator-enabled lighting unit, and produced the documentation showing that the floodlight operated entirely off-grid, using an independent backup power system for every activation. The inspector reviewed the documents, took photographs, and left without incident. Before departing, however, he made a passing remark, not accusatory, but telling. "You're not the first person on this block I've visited this month," he said, then added with a small shrug, "but you are the most prepared." That evening, Edward reviewed his own logs. He had begun keeping them in earnest after the second round of fixture damage. Every activation time, every duration, every adjustment to the beam angle was recorded. He documented correspondence, receipts, installation specs, and even drew a light exposure map for the backyard, clearly demonstrating the boundaries of illumination. His records were cleaner than any code required. But the next incident didn't come as a complaint. It came as a response. At exactly 2:15 a.m., 2 nights later, Edward was awoken by a loud metallic crash. The kind of noise that doesn't happen by accident. He got up, pulled on his robe and shoes, and stepped outside to find the floodlight mast on its side, the cables half pulled from their connections, and a dent in the side panel of the housing. It hadn't fallen. It had been pushed. The support legs, previously bolted into the ground with temporary anchors, had been kicked free, forcefully. A trail of disturbed mulch and crushed grass led away from the shed, stopping at the fence near Karen's property line. The gate was closed. No visible intrusion. But Edward didn't need to see anyone to understand the message. This time, he didn't touch the equipment. He left it as it was, took photos from every angle, and called the police non-emergency line. When the officer arrived an hour later, Edward walked him through the incident, provided full documentation, and handed over printed photos of the scene, including time-stamped images from earlier that week showing the unit intact and operational. The officer, professional and methodical, filed the report and confirmed that a case number would be issued. There were no cameras, no witnesses, but now there was damage. That constituted property destruction. Still minor, but official. Edward's quiet campaign of documentation had evolved from precaution to protection. In the following days, he replaced the damaged panel, secured the mast with reinforced locks, and added a motion-triggered alert system. No cameras, just an internal chime that would notify him of physical interference. And then he waited. He didn't activate the light, he didn't raise the beam. He simply let the equipment sit, silent and still for nearly a week. And then, late one evening, just after sunset, Karen's house went dark. Unusual. Her kitchen lights were always on, usually until midnight. That night, nothing. At first, Edward thought little of it. But then, as he checked his perimeter, he saw it. A faint red flicker in the corner of his garden, just above the soil line, facing the shed. Someone had placed a small laser level on a stake, aimed directly at the floodlight housing. It wasn't measuring anything. It was a signal. A provocation. Edward didn't remove it. He didn't even touch it. He simply returned to the house, pulled out his incident log, and made a new entry. No confrontation, no escalation. Just the cold, meticulous continuation of a quiet war where light, space, and silence had become weapons. The line had been crossed, and now there was no going back. The day after the laser marker appeared in Edward's garden, something shifted in him. Not drastically, not emotionally, but with the steady internal weight of confirmation. He no longer had to wonder whether he was imagining the conflict or reading too much into isolated provocations. No, it was all real, increasingly calculated, and increasingly physical. He had never confronted Karen directly, never accused her in person, never shouted across the fence or filed formal charges using her name, and yet the war between them was as clear as any spoken argument. The red flicker that pulsed against the dark soil hadn't measured anything. It had made a statement. She wasn't hiding her intent anymore because she didn't need to. She thought he wouldn't fight back. And he wouldn't, not in the way she was trying to provoke. But he was done playing cautiously. Instead of removing the laser, Edward left it in place, using it as a fixed point to recalibrate the sensor perimeter of his yard. If she was going to mark the ground, he would record what crossed it. He reconfigured his existing vibration and pressure systems, refined the threshold so they wouldn't be tripped by small animals or shifting branches, and added an ultrasonic ping field that responded to mass presence near the equipment shed. Not surveillance, not video, just presence. He adjusted the alerts to route silently to his phone through a private mesh network he had built for himself years ago, initially just to monitor water usage and electrical load during peak hours. Now it had another use entirely. The system pinged at 3:42 a.m. the following night. Just once. No second trigger. No return. She, or whoever she was employing, was testing the edge. But the real escalation came not with a new act of vandalism, but through paper. It arrived by certified mail, delivered in person by a courier who looked mildly uncomfortable holding it out for Edward to sign. The envelope was thick and printed on official legal stationery. The document inside was not a lawsuit, not yet, but a formal pre-litigation notice. The accusation, intentional and repeated illumination directed toward a residential dwelling in a manner consistent with harassment and public nuisance under section number redacted. Karen was listed only once, as a concerned resident and witness. The document did not allege specific damages, but it requested mediation under threat of further action, citing multiple community concerns, and noting the presence of a militarized lighting unit. Edward read the letter 3 times. His fingers remained still on the table as he processed each paragraph. The wording was clever. It was not a complaint about brightness or hours or sound. It was a suggestion that his actions constituted targeted aggression. And that mattered. Because once emotional harm or malicious intent entered the vocabulary of a complaint, the burden of proof shifted. Even if the device was legal, even if the light was contained, even if the hours were short and the placement defensible, the emotional claim could poison the process. That was the new battlefield. He didn't waste time on anger. Instead, he called his attorney. The woman was sharp, practical, and without flourish. After reading the documents, she issued 2 instructions. First, cease all activation of the floodlight unit until the mediation was complete. Any further use could be spun as continued harassment. Second, prepare a portfolio of defense materials including electrical specifications, purpose of installation, injury prevention reasoning, medical documentation related to his knee surgery, and the record of previous vandalism reports. Edward already had it all. He simply packaged it neatly and added timestamps. The mediation date was set for a Thursday afternoon at the Municipal Conflict Resolution Center. Neutral territory, no cameras, a third-party mediator, and 2 chairs set at opposite ends of a glass conference table. Karen arrived 10 minutes late. She was dressed sharply, hair tied back, glasses that gave her a precise, businesslike appearance, and a file in her hand thick enough to suggest preparation. Edward watched her enter without expression. She did not look at him. She greeted the mediator with exaggerated warmth, then sat down without glancing sideways. The mediator opened the session with protocol, reviewing the rules of the discussion, the boundaries of testimony, and the general purpose of the meeting. Edward said nothing at first. He waited, letting Karen speak, as was customary for the claimant. Her voice was clear, confident, and carefully moderated for tone. She did not accuse him of harassment. She described herself as concerned for her mental health, sleep quality, and physical safety, as a result of blinding high-wattage lighting placed in deliberate alignment with her bedroom window. She did not call him aggressive. She called him uncompromising and unapproachable. She never claimed damage. She claimed discomfort. She closed by suggesting an effort to restore peace and dignity to the neighborhood. The mediator nodded and turned to Edward. He unfolded his folder, methodically laid out the lighting specifications, photographs of the beam path, blueprints of his yard showing the exact cone of light, and then read from his prepared note. Not a rebuttal, not an emotional retort, but a structured explanation of events, the theft and destruction of lighting fixtures, the uninvited entry through his gate, the letters left on his property, and the photographic surveillance directed at his home. He did not use Karen's name in his statement. He referred to an individual or individuals responsible for a series of calculated interferences. He pointed out that all lighting systems installed met municipal code, and that the mobile lighting unit in question was a licensed temporary device used solely on his property with independent power. When he finished, Karen spoke again, this time with more force. She claimed the documentation was irrelevant to the emotional toll caused by the presence of a spotlight intentionally weaponized to intimidate. She claimed Edward's use of legal standards as a shield revealed an unwillingness to show empathy. She claimed optics matter. The mediator raised her hand, asking both parties to pause, then suggested a cooling period before recommendations would be issued. Karen exited the room first. She didn't speak, but as she passed Edward's chair, her glance shifted slightly downward, not out of submission, but with calculation. She knew this wasn't over, and so did he. The mediator's report arrived 3 days later. It didn't assign guilt, didn't recommend fines, but did formally encourage discontinuation of high-intensity lighting during overnight hours, and advised that both parties seek informal resolution to ongoing visibility concerns. In short, a push for compromise without teeth, but it wasn't a loss. The report included Edward's full technical portfolio as reference material, which meant it was now officially archived. The next night, Edward didn't turn on the floodlight. He didn't need to. His perimeter lights glowed softly, low and steady. He walked the length of his property after midnight, the wind quiet, the house still, and saw that Karen's blinds remained shut, her backyard completely dark. No porch light, no movement, no flicker of tension or provocation. It was a silence he had earned, not by shouting, not by lashing out, but by holding his ground with evidence, precision, and strategy. But as he reached the shed and locked the door for the night, his phone vibrated gently in his coat pocket. One alert, from the motion ping system. Triggered, again, just past the outer stones near the old laser marker, the spot she thought he would forget. He didn't react. He simply stood there in the dim halo of his pathlight, watching the shadows, knowing they were no longer vague. They had shape now. They had history. And they had not left. The next morning brought a brittle silence, the kind that doesn't feel restful but staged, like a room that's been too carefully tidied after a confrontation. Edward stepped out into the yard with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, though he hadn't taken a single sip. His eyes swept the property with the quiet vigilance of someone who had learned to trust absence as much as presence. The motion alert had registered, yes, but nothing had been touched. Nothing had been moved. No footprints, no broken lines, no shifted gravel. And yet there was a feeling in the air that something had already happened or was about to. Over the years, Edward had learned to respect those sensations, the subtle prickling of perception before reality caught up. They had saved him more than once in high-risk environments, and now they whispered again that something was brewing, just beyond the line of sight. By midday, it arrived not with noise, but with paper. A second envelope, this time hand-delivered by a different courier, heavier, more official. Inside, a formal statement of neighborhood petition, a printed document signed by what appeared to be multiple local residents claiming a pattern of antisocial behavior, citing Edward's lighting installations, alleged confrontational presence, and general demeanor as sources of distress. The wording had clearly been shaped by someone fluent in indirect legal language, phrases like perceived intimidation, patterned environmental encroachment, and intentional disregard for communal harmony echoed through every paragraph. There was no direct accusation of crime, nor any substantiated claim of property damage, but the document was clearly designed to suggest a profile, one that painted Edward as a hostile figure within a fragile social ecosystem. Karen's name appeared 3 times, each as a co-witness or impacted party. The final page requested that municipal mediation escalate the matter for behavioral review by a third-party community wellness panel. Edward sat with the petition in hand for nearly half an hour, rereading each line with an engineer's mind for calibration, noting not just what was said but how it was structured. The document did not attack his actions. It attacked his personality, his presence, his silence, even his restraint. It framed his refusal to engage as emotional volatility. It interpreted his technical solutions as paranoia. It was, in effect, an attempt to force redefinition, to take the role of quiet, methodical resident and rewrite him as the outlier, the irritant, the threat. He responded with precision. That afternoon, he contacted every name on the petition. Politely, without confrontation, without accusation. He left voicemails and notes in mailboxes, requesting a moment of conversation to clarify the nature of the signatures. Within 48 hours, 5 of the signatories had returned his calls. 3 admitted they had signed without fully reading the document, trusting Karen's characterization of the situation. 1 believed it was a neighborhood maintenance initiative. Another thought it had to do with road repairs. None had been told the document would be used to formally escalate a behavioral claim. Edward asked each, calmly and clearly, if they would be willing to submit a letter clarifying their misunderstanding. 4 agreed. 1 hesitated, citing fear of getting involved in drama. Edward thanked them all regardless, logged the responses, and moved on. He submitted the rebuttal to the mediation office with the letters attached, noting the discrepancies between what was claimed and what was understood. He made no counter-accusation, no personal attacks. He simply undercut the foundation of the petition with fact. Still, the petition had already moved the needle. A municipal advisor was scheduled to perform an informal site review to assess atmosphere, equipment presence, and compliance posture. The phrase compliance posture stuck with him. It was not about law, but about optics. The advisor arrived on a Monday morning. She was in her 30s, professional, clipboard in hand, polite to a fault. She walked the property, asked a few questions about the lighting setup, examined the fixtures, the control boxes, and even the generator, which sat dormant, covered, and secure. She noted the locations of every sensor, asked for documentation, which Edward provided in complete detail, and then remarked, not without irony, that This may be the most documented backyard in the county." He smiled faintly and said nothing. She left after an hour, but not before saying one thing that struck him as both telling and ominous. "Sometimes people interpret silence as aggression. It's unfair, but it happens. I'd recommend visibility. Controlled visibility." That night, Edward didn't react with light. He didn't power on the beam or adjust the sensors. He did something more effective. He walked out into his front yard, pulled up a chair, and sat. In full view, with a book. Just past sunset, as the streetlights flickered on, he sat in complete stillness, reading under the soft glow of his porch light. For 2 hours. He didn't move. He didn't patrol. He didn't watch. He simply existed, visibly and peacefully, on his own land. The next night, he did the same. And the night after that. Neighbors began to wave. Some paused to say hello. One brought over a thermos of coffee. Karen never emerged. But the calm broke 4 nights later. At 2:07 a.m., the alert system pinged 3 times in rapid succession. Vibration, then pressure, then mass detection near the shed. Edward, already awake from years of trained light sleep, moved quickly but silently. He didn't open the back door or trigger lights. He checked his system log first. The sequence was definitive. Someone had moved past the fence line, stepped onto the stone path, and hovered near the shed for at least 25 seconds. He opened the side window just slightly, enough to hear movement outside. There was nothing now, only the quiet wind. He waited another 10 minutes, then went out. The laser marker had returned, this time with 2 mirrors staked on either side of the beam, reflecting the red light at sharp angles toward the upper fence. This was not random mischief. This was a triangulation device. Edward took photos, collected the items without touching their active surfaces, and sealed them in a container. In the morning, he called the police again, not to report a burglary, but to formally request an expanded investigation into targeted harassment. The responding officer was the same one from the floodlight incident. This time, his tone was different. He listened, took detailed notes, and recommended Edward apply for a protective measure. Not against a person, but as a precaution related to property boundary violations. It wouldn't stop anything legally, but it would force a record of recurring incidents into a formal channel. 3 days later, Karen escalated again. She appeared on his property in daylight. Not aggressively, not suddenly. She stood at the edge of the driveway as Edward was coiling extension cords. She didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice was sharp but brittle, lacking the performative rhythm it had carried in mediation. "Are you enjoying this?" she asked. Edward didn't answer. She stepped forward half a pace. "I know what you're doing. You think you're clever, but you're making people uncomfortable. This isn't normal behavior." Still, he said nothing. Karen's mouth twisted, not in anger but in something colder. Frustration, maybe. Or desperation. "You think silence makes you innocent? You're making yourself the problem, not just for me." Then she turned and walked away. Edward stood there a long time, the cord forgotten in his hand. Her words weren't a threat. They were a shift. He'd seen that look before. In audits, in negotiations, in moments just before someone tried to rewrite the rules out of desperation. Karen had expected him to lash out, to curse, to fail loudly so she could hold it up to the world. Instead, he had forced her into silence with silence. But now she had crossed onto his property. That was new. That was usable. He wrote down the exchange, time-stamped it, and began drafting a legal letter, not to her, but to the community advisor, outlining the ongoing boundary issues and the unprompted confrontation. He didn't embellish. He didn't theorize. He reported. That night, he turned the light on again. Only briefly. 15 minutes. Low angle. Filtered beam. It was enough. The next morning, spray paint appeared on the sidewalk outside his home. 2 words: "Get out." Edward didn't call the police this time. He called a lawyer, and the escalation crossed into something else entirely. The paint remained on the sidewalk for 2 days. Edward hadn't rushed to scrub it away, not out of apathy, but as a calculated choice. He wanted it to sit there, to be seen by neighbors, to become a part of the street's visual rhythm. Let it sink in that someone had reached that point. Let it stop being just his problem. He had already filed the report. He had already documented everything: date, time, photos, the positioning of the message, the angle of the spray, even the direction of the splatter pattern indicating where the person must have stood while writing it. He didn't need the words gone. He needed them recorded. On the 3rd morning, a municipal cleaning crew came. Not police, not a courtesy visit. Just an order issued by the city sanitation department based on a vandalism cleanup request. No mention of the underlying situation. They removed the paint without speaking to him. Just 2 men in uniforms with masks and pressure hoses. Then they drove away. But the damage wasn't just aesthetic. What the paint did, what Karen had wanted it to do, was change the air around him. Neighbors started walking faster past his property. Conversations that used to pause near his mailbox now dissolved 20 feet early. Even those who had expressed sympathy before now avoided eye contact. He had become radioactive, not through anything he had said or done, but through presence alone. She had finally succeeded in framing him as the problem, not through evidence, but through repetition and spectacle. Yet that success came too late to help her. What Karen didn't anticipate was that Edward had already taken the final step in his quiet campaign. 1 week before the paint, he had begun working with a private security consulting firm that specialized in defensive property preparation. Not fences or cameras, but legal-proof structural documentation. He had retained them not for protection, but for clarity. They had walked the property, measured every light cone, every wire path, every fixture's angle. They compiled a dossier not just of compliance, but of intentional restraint. And now that the sidewalk had been defaced and she had crossed the line with a physical public message, that dossier had become ammunition. Edward didn't file a lawsuit. He submitted a formal cease and desist order through his attorney, naming Karen directly, supported by the accumulated reports, incident logs, mediation records, correspondence samples, and now the vandalism incident. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a pre-litigation warning backed by legal standing, a line drawn in unambiguous terms. The letter was delivered by courier, signed for, dated, certified. The reaction came swiftly. Within 48 hours, Karen filed her own police report, claiming harassment, psychological intimidation, and light-based targeting. She presented photos of the mobile floodlight, snapshots of his porch from across the street, and even tried to use the audio from their brief driveway exchange as proof of threatening behavior. The officer assigned to her case contacted Edward, reviewed the full context, received a copy of the cease and desist, and quietly informed him that, in his professional opinion, this is retaliation. The most damning part for her wasn't the contradiction. It was the pattern. With every complaint, she introduced a new version of Edward's behavior, one where he somehow controlled the entire emotional climate of the block. The contradiction was visible even to law enforcement. And worse, the dates on her report were filed after the cease and desist. They looked like a response, not an escalation. Meanwhile, Edward remained quiet. He didn't engage. He didn't resume light operations. The mobile unit stayed covered, the yard silent. His house returned to stillness, and the only signs of movement were his early morning walks along the edges of the garden and the occasional trip to the post office. But then came the final provocation. At 1:48 a.m., on a Thursday night, Edward was awakened by the shattering sound of glass. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was the full, violent crack of something heavy hitting a window pane. He sat up, completely awake in seconds. Not panicked, just alert. He moved through the house silently, reached the front room, and found his front-facing window, intact but spiderwebbed with cracks, struck dead center with a rock the size of a fist. It had bounced back and landed on the porch tiles. He didn't touch it. He picked up the phone and dialed the police. This time there was no ambiguity, no delay. Officers arrived within 20 minutes. They examined the scene, the rock, the trajectory, and took statements. A neighbor from 2 houses down provided doorbell footage, not of the throw, but of a hooded figure walking toward Edward's house minutes before the noise, then sprinting back the other direction immediately after. The figure's identity wasn't visible, but the build, the posture, the speed. It was someone fit, younger than Edward, perhaps male. Perhaps not. The footage was inconclusive, but the officers logged the incident as felony vandalism due to property damage exceeding a certain threshold. They canvassed the neighborhood. Most doors remained closed. But the next morning, 2 quiet emails landed in Edward's inbox. Neighbors offering to speak now that it had gone that far. Now that it was physical. Now that it wasn't just about light or mood or silence. But the real consequence hit Karen. A city investigator, prompted by the now formal criminal report, began auditing the ongoing complaints filed from her address. This was standard practice under a certain clause that prevented weaponized reporting. It wasn't punishment. It was policy. And when Edward's compiled documentation was cross-referenced with her filing dates and statements, the inconsistencies stood out, especially the claim that she had no direct contact with Edward after mediation, despite the recorded driveway. Encounter and the time-stamped delivery of the cease and desist. Karen received a notice of administrative review. No criminal charges, no fine, but a citation for misusing civic resources. And just like that, the narrative shifted. It didn't swing fully in Edward's favor. It didn't erase the discomfort or make neighbors come rushing back with casseroles and apologies. But it placed a pin in the story, a marker that not all silence is guilt and not all performance is truth. The light remained off. The sensors stayed on. The rock was removed, the window repaired, and the mobile unit locked behind reinforced barriers. Karen stopped appearing. Her blinds remained closed. Her porch light never flicked on again. And Edward each night returned to his chair at sunset, sat for an hour in view of the street, read quietly under a perfectly legal, warm-toned fixture, and let the silence tell the rest. By the start of the following month, the street had begun to forget. Not entirely, and not intentionally, but in the slow, inevitable way that communities bury tension under routine. The sidewalks were swept again, the air turned cooler in the evenings, and the warm amber light of porch lamps returned to most homes. Conversations resumed, guarded at first, then less so. Children began playing nearer to Edward's property again, their parents offering stiff nods that eventually softened with each uneventful day. The shattered window was repaired, the paint on the sidewalk long washed away, and even the floodlight, still covered, still dormant, had begun to blend into the scenery like a garden tool left out of season. What hadn't returned, however, was Karen. Her blinds remained closed during the day and night, and for the better part of 2 weeks her car didn't move from the driveway. The once meticulously pruned hedges around her property began to overgrow, climbing awkwardly around the iron gate that had always been kept so rigidly shut. No mail appeared in her box. No visitors came to the door. It was as if she had removed herself, not physically but socially, retreating into a kind of strategic invisibility. Edward noticed, of course. He noticed everything. But he did not inquire, did not speak her name, did not speculate when neighbors mentioned, with carefully phrased curiosity, that she hadn't been around much lately. He simply replied that he hoped everyone on the street was well, then changed the subject. The security measures remained in place, but their purpose had changed. They no longer served as a deterrent. They had become routine, quiet systems of reassurance more than defense. Edward had stopped documenting minor disturbances. He no longer recorded every footfall or clipped branch. There were no more midnight alerts, no more photos in the mailbox, no more laser pointers buried in the soil. The quiet that settled over the property was not sterile or fearful. It was earned. The kind of quiet that follows not surrender, but proof of endurance. And with that quiet came restoration. Edward resumed work on the garden. He repaired a section of the path that had shifted in the early rains, repainted the eastern fence, and added a few new plants along the back corner. Hardy, drought-resistant ones that wouldn't need much tending but would add color when they bloomed. He rebuilt one of the low-voltage lighting fixtures, the one nearest the gate, using a different style of housing. Sleeker, slightly more decorative, but still compliant. He didn't activate them. He didn't need to. Their presence was enough. They stood as quiet declarations saying everything without having to be turned on. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2. Karen's house remained dark and untouched. Eventually, a realtor's sign appeared in the front yard. Subtle at first, a small "by appointment only" notice clipped near the hedge. No open house, no announcement, just a quiet shift. The house was sold within 3 weeks. A moving truck came early one morning, and Karen didn't appear once during the entire loadout. 2 men did all the work. No goodbyes were exchanged. By sunset, the house was empty. A new family moved in the following month, a couple with 2 children and a large, slow-moving Labrador that took to sleeping near the garden fence. The dog never barked. The children waved shyly. The parents introduced themselves with cautious optimism, aware of the property's reputation but determined to start anew. Edward welcomed them without hesitation. He offered a simple greeting, answered a few of their questions about power lines and fence boundaries, then let them settle in without pressing further. Their presence didn't erase the past, but it filled the space it had left behind. And Edward, for the first time in many months, felt something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. Not victory, not vindication, but release. Not everything had been fair. Not everything had been resolved in a clean arc. But he had held the line. Not just the property line, but the line between reaction and reason, between escalation and dignity. He hadn't tried to expose Karen. He had simply refused to disappear,